It was an ordinary autumn morning in Willow Creek, a small, close-knit town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets rarely remained hidden. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm orange hue over the modest homes and winding streets. Mark Davis, a 45-year-old mechanic, woke to the sound of his alarm blaring at 6 a.m. like it did it every morning. He stretched, yawned, and glanced out the window. It was just another day, or so he thought. Mark had lived in Willow Creek his entire life. He'd taken over his father's auto repair shop after graduating high school and never looked back. Life was simple, and that's the way Mark liked it. His first wife had passed away unexpectedly 5 years ago, leaving him to raise their daughter, Emily, who was just 7 at the time. Her death had shattered him, but after years of struggling through grief, he had finally met Sophie, a charming woman who had recently moved to Willow Creek. They married 2 years ago. Sophie was beautiful, organized, and always knew how to win people over with her friendly smile and her active involvement in local charity events. To most people, she seemed perfect. But for the past few months, something had been gnawing at Mark. Small things that were easy to dismiss but unsettling all the same. Emily, now 12, had grown unusually quiet. She was always shy, but recently she had become almost withdrawn. Every time Sophie entered the room, Emily would freeze or shift uncomfortably in her seat. Mark had noticed it, but he didn't want to push. He figured it was just typical adolescent behavior. Sophie, after all, had been nothing but loving toward Emily, at least in front of him. Mark shook the thoughts away as he got ready for the day. He made his way downstairs, the smell of coffee and toast filling the air. Sophie was already in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast. Her blonde hair was tied back in a neat bun, and she wore an apron, looking like the picture-perfect stepmother. Emily sat at the table, staring blankly at her cereal bowl. "Morning, ladies," Mark said with a grin, hoping to inject some cheer into the room. Sophie smiled back, but Emily barely glanced up. "How'd you sleep?" Sophie asked in her usual chipper tone. "Like a rock," Mark said, grabbing his cup of coffee. He glanced at Emily. "You okay, sweetie?" Emily shrugged, muttering a soft, "I'm fine," before shoving another spoonful of cereal into her mouth. Sophie glanced at her smile tightening. "She's probably just tired," Sophie said lightly, reaching out to touch Emily's arm. "Right, honey, you stayed up pretty late last night." Emily flinched, pulling her arm back quickly. Mark noticed the reaction, but Sophie didn't seem to care. "I guess," Emily mumbled, avoiding eye contact with either of them. Mark felt a pang of concern. Something was wrong, but what? He pushed it to the back of his mind as he gathered his things for work. As he was about to head out the door, Emily suddenly spoke up. "Dad, can I talk to you for a minute?" Mark paused, surprised by the urgency in her voice. He glanced at Sophie, who was cleaning up the dishes, then back at Emily. "Of course, sweetie. What's up?" Emily hesitated, glancing nervously at Sophie. "Alone," she whispered. Mark's stomach tightened. "Sure. Let's step outside," he said, nodding toward the door. He could feel Sophie's eyes on him as he followed Emily out onto the front porch. Once they were outside, Emily's demeanor changed. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if she were afraid someone might be watching. "What's going on, Emily?" Mark asked, his voice soft but firm. Emily took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "Dad, something's wrong with Sophie." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He knelt down to her level, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" Emily bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't think she's who she says she is." Mark frowned. "Emily, what are you talking about?" "I've been hearing things," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "At night, when you're asleep. She talks to someone, but there's no one there. She says weird things, like she's planning something bad. I don't know what, but I'm scared." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He stared at his daughter, trying to process what she was saying. Sophie, talking to someone in the middle of the night. It didn't make any sense, but the fear in Emily's eyes was real. Emily, are you sure? Maybe you were just dreaming, he suggested, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. No, Dad, I wasn't dreaming, Emily insisted. It's real. Last night, I heard her say she was going to do something to us. Emily, are you sure? Maybe you were just dreaming, he suggested, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. No, Dad, I wasn't dreaming, Emily insisted. It's real. Last night, I heard her say she was going to do something to us. Mark's mind reeled. Sophie, planning something. He didn't know what to think. He wanted to believe it was just Emily's imagination, but there was something about the way she spoke, the terror in her voice, that made it impossible to dismiss. Okay, he said, trying to stay calm. I'll look into it. Don't worry, okay? I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Emily nodded, but the fear didn't leave her eyes. She hugged him tightly before heading back inside, leaving Mark standing on the porch, his heart pounding in his chest. As Mark drove to work, Emily's words echoed in his mind. She's planning something bad. But what? Sophie had always been kind, if not a little distant. They'd never had any major problems. Still, Mark couldn't shake the unease that settled in his stomach. At the shop, Mark found it difficult to focus. Every time he tried to push the thoughts away, they came rushing back, stronger than before. He began to recall strange moments over the past few months, how Sophie would sometimes disappear for hours, claiming she had meetings for her volunteer work, but never saying with whom, or the way she'd smile at him, but the smile never quite reached her eyes. And then there was Emily. His daughter had always been quiet, but now that he thought about it, she'd been more than quiet. She'd been scared. How had he missed that? By the time Mark returned home that evening, his anxiety had grown into full-blown suspicion. Sophie greeted him at the door with her usual warmth, but to Mark, it felt forced. His eyes scanned the house, searching for something, anything, that seemed out of place. Dinner was a quiet affair. Emily barely spoke, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was watching both of them too closely. After dinner, Mark tucked Emily into bed. As he kissed her goodnight, she grabbed his arm. Dad, don't forget what I said. Please. I won't, Mark promised, his voice thick with emotion. I'll figure it out. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Mark sat alone in the living room, his mind racing. He decided to check Sophie's computer, something he'd never done before, feeling a pang of guilt for even considering it. But as he opened her laptop, he found it was locked with a password he didn't know. That night, Mark barely slept. He lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house, his heart pounding with every creak and groan. At one point, he thought he heard something, a faint whisper from down the hall. But when he got up to check, everything seemed normal. As dawn broke, Mark realized that whatever was happening in his home wasn't something he could ignore any longer. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Little did he know, the truth he would uncover would change everything. This part sets the stage for a seemingly normal life that is slowly unraveling as Mark begins to suspect that something dark lurks beneath the surface. His daughter's fear is genuine, but the extent of the threat is still unknown. The tension is building as Mark starts his journey toward discovering the terrifying truth about Sophie. The morning after Emily's chilling confession, Mark couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in his gut. He sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into his coffee, while Sophie busied herself around the house. She hummed softly, seemingly oblivious to the tension that now weighed heavy in the air. Emily had already left for school, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts and Sophie's unnerving presence. Mark's mind raced, replaying Emily's words from the previous night over and over again. She's planning something bad. His rational side told him that Emily was just imagining things, that maybe she had misunderstood something Sophie said. But there was another part of him, a darker, more primal part, that couldn't ignore the fear in Emily's eyes. That fear was real, and it gnawed at him like a splinter buried deep in his skin. He glanced up at Sophie as she moved around the kitchen, her back turned to him. Her movements were fluid, almost too perfect. How had he not noticed before how controlled, how precise she always was? Her blonde hair, always neatly tied back, her clothes always ironed and spotless, her smile always fixed just the right way. It all felt rehearsed. "Sophie," Mark called, his voice tight. She turned, flashing him that same practiced smile. "Yes, darling. Do you have any plans for today?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed the suspicion lurking beneath the surface. Sophie raised an eyebrow, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Nothing special, just running a few errands. I have a meeting with the Women's Charity Committee this afternoon, and then I'll be back before dinner." "Why?" Mark hesitated. He didn't want to raise alarms, not yet. He needed more information before he could confront her. "No reason," he said finally, forcing a smile. "I just thought maybe we could spend some time together later." Sophie's eyes flickered, just for a split second, but Mark caught it. A brief moment of hesitation. Was she hiding something? "Of course," she said smoothly. "We'll have dinner together, like always." Mark nodded, his mind already racing. He needed to know more, to dig deeper, but how could he do that without tipping her off? As Sophie left for her errands, Mark decided to act. He would follow her, see where she went, and who she met. Maybe then he could put Emily's fears to rest, or uncover something far worse. Mark waited a few minutes after Sophie left before grabbing his keys and heading out the door. His heart pounded in his chest as he climbed into his truck, trying to push away the guilt gnawing at him for spying on his own wife. But this wasn't just about him. This was about Emily. If Sophie was truly a threat, he needed to know. He drove slowly through the narrow streets of Willow Creek, keeping a safe distance behind Sophie's car as she made her way across town. She stopped briefly at the post office, then the bank, nothing out of the ordinary. Mark began to relax, thinking maybe he had overreacted. But then Sophie made a turn down a back road leading out of town, a road that didn't go anywhere near the charity office where she was supposedly headed. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he followed her down the winding road, his mind racing with possibilities. What was she doing out here? This area was mostly farmland and woods, hardly a place for a charity meeting. After a few miles, Sophie's car pulled off onto a gravel path leading to an old, abandoned farmhouse that had been empty for years. Mark parked his truck at a distance, hiding it behind a cluster of trees. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched Sophie step out of the car and walk toward the dilapidated building. Why was she here? What could she possibly want with an old, forgotten house? Mark waited, his breath shallow, as Sophie disappeared inside. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Mark's anxiety mounted with each passing second. He couldn't just sit here. He had to know what she was doing in there. He climbed out of his truck, moving cautiously toward the house. The wind rustled through the trees, sending chills down his spine as he approached the broken-down front porch. The windows were dusty, cracked, and impossible to see through. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he pressed his ear against the wood. For a moment, all he heard was silence. Then, faint voices, a conversation, but there was something strange about it. He could only hear one voice. Sophie's voice. It was low, as if she was speaking to someone, but no other voice responded. Mark felt his stomach tighten. He carefully pushed the door open, wincing as it creaked loudly. The interior of the farmhouse was dark and musty, cobwebs hanging from the rafters. Dust covered every surface, but the faint sound of Sophie's voice continued from somewhere deeper inside. Mark crept through the front room, following the sound of her voice to what appeared to be the kitchen. He paused just outside the doorway, his heart thudding in his chest. "Don't worry," It'll all be over soon, Sophie was saying, her voice calm and composed. I've already taken care of the last part. No one suspects a thing. Mark's blood ran cold. She was talking to someone, but there was no one else there. You've been so helpful, Sophie continued, her tone almost affectionate. I couldn't have done this without you. Once Mark and Emily are out of the way, everything will fall into place. Mark's mind reeled. Out of the way. What was she talking about? His throat went dry, and his hands began to tremble as he peeked around the corner. Sophie stood in the center of the room, facing a dusty, cracked mirror. She was staring at her own reflection, her lips moving as she spoke in a low, conspiratorial tone. But there was no one else in the room. Mark's heart pounded in his ears. Who was she talking to? Was she planning something against him and Emily? His body tensed as he strained to hear more. Sophie's voice dropped even lower, and Mark had to lean in closer to catch her words. Soon, they'll both be gone, and I'll finally be free. Free? Free from what? Or from who? Mark's blood turned to ice as the realization hit him like a freight train. Sophie wasn't talking to anyone else. She was talking to herself. Or worse, was she talking to something unseen? Suddenly, Sophie turned, her eyes flickering toward the doorway. Mark ducked back, his heart racing. Had she seen him? He held his breath, waiting for her to call out, to confront him. But nothing came. After what felt like an eternity, Mark heard her footsteps move toward the front door. He waited, listening to the sound of her leaving the house, and only when he was sure she was gone did he dare to move. Mark stepped into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the room. The mirror Sophie had been speaking to was old and grimy, but something about it sent a shiver down his spine. He glanced around, noticing a notebook lying open on the counter. It was filled with handwritten notes, Sophie's handwriting, detailing strange rituals and plans. There were names written in the margins, names of people who had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances in nearby towns. Some of the names were crossed out. Mark's stomach churned. What the hell was this? Was Sophie involved in something darker than he had ever imagined? He quickly snapped pictures of the notebook with his phone, his hands shaking. He needed to get out of there. Now. As Mark hurried back to his truck, his mind raced. He had to protect Emily, but how? What if Sophie had already set her plan in motion? He didn't know who to trust or where to turn, but one thing was certain. The woman he had married was not who she claimed to be. And whatever she was planning, it was far worse than he had ever feared. This part delves deeper into Mark's growing suspicion, building the tension as he uncovers unsettling evidence that Sophie is not only hiding something, but maybe plotting something dangerous. The story introduces eerie elements and a sense of impending dread, while keeping the focus on Mark's inner turmoil and his drive to protect his daughter. The stakes are higher, and Mark is now trapped in a web of fear and doubt, unsure of who or what he's really dealing with. Mark's heart pounded as he sped away from the abandoned farmhouse, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The image of Sophie standing in front of that cracked mirror, speaking to no one, or worse, to something, lingered in his mind. The notebook with her bizarre, ritualistic notes, and the names of people who had vanished or died. It was too much to process. His once perfect life was crumbling, and he could no longer deny the truth. Sophie was hiding something dark, something terrifying. But what now? He couldn't just go to the police with a few photographs of an old notebook and a story about his wife talking to herself in an abandoned farmhouse. They'd think he was crazy. Hell, he was starting to think he was crazy. He had to be smart. Emily was still in the house, and that meant he couldn't afford to make any reckless moves. He needed to gather more evidence to understand the full scope of what Sophie was planning. When Mark got home that evening, Sophie greeted him at the door as if nothing was wrong. Her smile was warm, her eyes bright, and her voice as sweet as ever. She asked how his day was and kissed him on the cheek. For a moment, he almost questioned everything, almost wondered if he had imagined the whole thing. But then he looked into her eyes, and there was something cold, something calculated behind that smile. It wasn't the warmth of a loving wife. It was the smile of someone who was hiding something. As they sat down for dinner, Emily barely touched her food. Her eyes flicked nervously from her father to Sophie, and Mark could sense the tension radiating off her. She knew something was wrong, but she was too afraid to say anything. "Emily, are you okay?" Mark asked, trying to sound casual. Emily glanced at him, then at Sophie before nodding quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine." Sophie smiled, her voice smooth as silk. "She's just a little tired. Aren't you, sweetheart? She's been staying up too late lately. But don't worry, I'll make sure she gets to bed on time tonight." Emily's face drained of color at Sophie's words, and Mark's stomach twisted. Something about the way Sophie spoke, as if she had control over every aspect of Emily's life, sent a chill down his spine. After dinner, Sophie went upstairs, claiming she had a headache. As soon as she was out of earshot, Emily leaned over to Mark, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad, please, you have to do something. I'm scared." Mark reached across the table and took her hand. "I know, sweetheart. I'm going to figure this out. Just stay strong a little longer, okay?" Emily nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't think she's going to let us leave. I overheard her talking last night. She said we're in the way." Mark's heart sank. Emily was right. Whatever Sophie was planning, it involved them, and not in a good way. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He lay awake in bed, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling, every noise making his heart race. Sophie lay beside him, sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and slow. But Mark knew better. He knew what she was capable of, and he couldn't let his guard down. He had to keep watch, had to protect Emily. Around 2 a.m., Mark heard something, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from downstairs. His body tensed. He slowly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sophie, and crept toward the door. The house was dark and still, but the whispering continued, growing louder as he made his way down the hall. Mark stopped at the top of the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispering wasn't coming from downstairs. It was coming from the basement. The basement door was slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered from within. Mark hadn't been in the basement for months. It was mostly used for storage, filled with old boxes and broken furniture, nothing important. But now, as he stood there listening to the eerie whispers drifting up from below, he realized he had no idea what Sophie might be doing down there. Steeling himself, Mark descended the stairs, his feet making no sound on the wooden steps. The air grew colder the farther he went, and the whispers became clearer. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, like a low chant or incantation. When he reached the bottom, Mark froze. The basement had been transformed. What was once a cluttered storage space was now meticulously organized. Shelves lined the walls, filled with strange objects, candles, jars of herbs, and old leather-bound books. In the center of the room was a small table, and on it sat a large ornate mirror. The same mirror he had seen Sophie talking to in the farmhouse. Sophie was standing in front of it, her back to him, speaking in that same low, conspiratorial tone. The words were foreign, a language Mark didn't recognize, but there was something about her posture, the way her shoulders were hunched forward, her hands outstretched toward the mirror, that made his skin crawl. Mark swallowed hard, his mind racing. What was she doing? Was this some kind of ritual? Who, or what, was she talking to? Suddenly, Sophie stopped. The room went silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Mark held his breath, praying she hadn't noticed him. But then, without warning, Sophie turned. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a split second, there was nothing human in her gaze. "Mark," she said, her voice calm and cold. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find me." Mark's blood turned to ice. His hand shook, his mind scrambling for something to say, but no words came. He was rooted to the spot, trapped in her gaze. Sophie stepped toward him, her face expressionless. I know you've been watching me. And I know what you're thinking. But you don't understand, Mark. You never did. What? What is this? Mark finally managed to stammer, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie smiled, but it wasn't the warm, loving smile he had once known. It was something darker, something sinister. This is how it has to be. You and Emily. You're in the way. Mark's heart raced. In the way of what? Sophie didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the mirror, placing her hands on its frame. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier. Mark could feel a pressure building, like something was pushing against him from all sides. I don't want to hurt you, Mark, Sophie said, her voice soft but dangerous. But I will, if I have to. Mark's mind raced. He had to get out of there. He had to protect Emily. Without another word, he turned and bolted up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear Sophie's footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. When Mark reached the top of the stairs, he slammed the basement door shut and locked it. His hand shook as he grabbed his phone and dialed his friend John, the only person he could think to call in that moment. John, it's Mark, he said, his voice shaking. I need your help. It's Sophie. Something's wrong. I think she's dangerous. John was silent for a moment. Then his voice came through, tense and concerned. Mark, calm down. What are you talking about? I don't have time to explain, Mark said, glancing over his shoulder at the basement door. But I need you to come over. Now. I'm on my way, John said, and the line went dead. Mark hung up the phone, his hands trembling. He had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. Sophie was no longer the woman he had married. Something had changed, and whatever it was dangerous. John arrived 20 minutes later, his face lined with concern as he stepped into the house. What's going on, Mark? You sounded panicked on the phone. Mark led him into the living room, his voice hushed. It's Sophie. She's not herself. I think she's planning something, John. Something bad. John frowned, glancing around the room. What do you mean? What did you see? Mark hesitated, unsure how to explain everything he had witnessed. The strange rituals, the whispering in the basement, the notebook filled with names. It all sounded insane. But before he could say anything, there was a loud crash from the basement. John's eyes widened. What the hell was that? Mark's heart raced. It's her. The two men rushed to the basement door. But when Mark threw it open, the room was empty. The mirror was gone, the shelves bare. It was as if the room had never been transformed at all. John turned to Mark, his expression serious. Mark, I don't know what's going on, but we need to get Emily out of here. Now. Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They didn't have much time. Whatever Sophie was planning, it was happening soon. And if they didn't act fast, it might be too late. This part escalates the tension and begins to fracture Mark's sense of reality. Sophie's true nature starts to emerge. The next few hours after John's arrival were a blur of panic and paranoia. The house felt different now. Its once familiar walls now seemed like they were closing in on Mark. He couldn't shake the image of Sophie in the basement, whispering to the mirror, speaking in that strange, foreign language. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The ticking of the clock, the creaking of the floorboards, even the hum of the refrigerator seemed ominous. Mark stood by the window, his heart racing as he watched the front yard for any sign of Sophie. She had left the house shortly after the loud crash, her car speeding away into the night. He didn't know where she had gone, but he feared what she would do next. John paced the living room, his brow furrowed. He was a big, burly man with years of working in construction behind him, but even he looked uneasy. Mark, you've got to tell me everything. What's going on with Sophie? What did you see down there? Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. How could he explain everything? It sounded insane, even to him. but he had to try. "John, I don't know where to start. I've been noticing things for a while, things that didn't make sense. Emily told me Sophie's been acting strange, and at first I didn't believe her. But then I saw it myself. Sophie, she's been doing something dark. I followed her to an old farmhouse, and she was talking to herself, or maybe someone I couldn't see. Then there's the basement. She's been performing rituals, speaking in some language I've never heard before. And there was a notebook, John. It had names in it, names of people who've disappeared or died. I think she's planning something. And we're part of it." John stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Mark, this sounds crazy. Are you sure you're not just, I don't know, seeing things?" Mark shook his head, his voice rising with desperation. "I'm not crazy, John. I saw it with my own eyes. She's dangerous. We have to get Emily out of here before she comes back." John nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. "Okay, we'll get Emily. But where will we go? If Sophie's involved in something like this, we need a plan. We can't just run blindly." Mark's mind raced, but before he could answer, the sound of the front door creaking open echoed through the house. Both men froze. Mark's heart dropped into his stomach. She was back. He motioned for John to stay quiet as they listened. Footsteps, light and careful, made their way across the hardwood floor. It wasn't Sophie's usual confident stride. No, this was something else. A different kind of presence. Suddenly, Emily appeared in the hallway, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She ran to Mark, throwing her arms around him. "Dad, she's back. I saw her. She's outside, talking to someone in the yard." Mark's blood ran cold. He glanced at John, who immediately moved to the window. Peeking through the curtains, John's eyes widened. "Mark," he whispered, "she's not alone." Mark moved to the window and looked out. His stomach twisted at the sight. Sophie was standing in the middle of the front yard, her back to the house, speaking in that same eerie foreign language. But she wasn't speaking to anyone visible. She stood there alone, gesturing with her hands as if someone, or something, was standing right in front of her. "We need to get out of here," Mark whispered, pulling Emily close to him. "Now." John nodded, his face grim. "Let's take my truck. We'll drive to my place and figure this out from there." They quickly gathered what little they could: keys, wallets, phones. Mark grabbed the notebook he had taken from the basement, tucking it under his arm. As they moved toward the back door, trying to avoid Sophie's line of sight, Mark's mind raced with thoughts of what he'd seen. How did it all go so wrong so fast? Once they were safely inside John's truck, speeding down the dark country roads toward the outskirts of town, Mark finally let himself breathe. Emily was in the back seat, curled up and shaking, her small body racked with fear. Mark reached back and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's going to be okay, sweetie. I promise." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. John broke the silence after a few minutes. "We need to figure out what the hell is going on, Mark. This isn't just some marital dispute or a misunderstanding. If Sophie is involved in something dark, we need to understand what we're up against." Mark nodded, glancing down at the notebook in his lap. The leather cover felt rough under his fingers, the pages inside filled with Sophie's tight, precise handwriting. "This book, it has answers. I think Sophie's been planning this for a long time." John pulled over onto a dirt road just outside of town. The moonlight cast eerie shadows over the trees, and the silence was suffocating. "Let's take a look at it," John said, his voice tense. Mark flipped open the notebook and began to skim through the pages, his eyes narrowing as he deciphered the cryptic symbols and notes. Some of it was in English, but much of it was written in a language he didn't understand. What stood out most were the names of people from the surrounding towns who had disappeared or died mysteriously over the years. Some of the names were crossed out, while others had dates next to them, dates that hadn't yet come to pass. Mark's stomach churned. "These are people she's been targeting," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's been involved in something, John. Something evil." John frowned, his eyes scanning the pages. "Rituals. Dark magic. This can't be real, Mark. This stuff only happens in movies." Mark shook his head. "I don't know what to believe anymore. But Sophie's not the woman I thought she was. We need to find out what she's planning." Emily, who had been silent until now, spoke up from the back seat, her voice trembling. "Dad, I heard her talking last night. She said she needed to finish the ritual before the next full moon. That's in 3 days. She said something about needing us." Mark's heart sank. 3 days. They didn't have much time. John turned the truck back onto the road, his face set in grim determination. "We're going to have to find someone who can help us understand this, someone who knows more about this kind of thing." The following morning, Mark, John, and Emily found themselves at the home of Margaret Halloway, an elderly woman who had lived in Willow Creek for as long as anyone could remember. Margaret was known around town as a bit of an eccentric, someone who knew all the old folklore, the legends, and the darker history of the area. Mark had never given much thought to the stories she told, but now, in light of everything that was happening, he was desperate for answers. Margaret welcomed them into her small, cluttered home, her sharp eyes studying them with an intensity that made Mark uneasy. "I heard about your wife," she said simply, motioning for them to sit at her kitchen table. "People talk, you know." Mark swallowed hard. We think Sophie is involved in something dangerous." Margaret nodded, as if she had already expected this. "I'm not surprised. There's been a darkness hanging over this town for years, and it's only gotten worse. Your wife, she's part of it, isn't she?" Mark hesitated. "Part of what?" Margaret's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "There's an old legend around these parts, a coven of witches, long ago, who were said to have made a pact with something dark. They were driven out, or so the stories say. But some of them stayed hidden, kept their secrets. They've been waiting, planning, and it sounds like your wife might be one of them." Mark's blood ran cold. "Witches? You think Sophie is a witch?" Margaret shrugged. "Call them what you want. Witches, cultists. They're people who practice dark magic, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get what they want. I don't know what your wife's plan is, but if she's involved with them, you're in grave danger." Mark glanced at John, whose face was pale. "We only have 3 days until the full moon. She's planning something then. What do we do?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice low. "You can't face her alone. If she's powerful, she'll have protections in place. You need to find a way to break her connection to whatever she's using. There are rituals, ways to protect yourself, but you'll need help. I know a few people who might be able to assist you, but time is running out." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He had come here hoping for answers, but now all he had were more questions, and an even greater sense of urgency. He had 3 days to stop Sophie, to protect Emily, and to figure out what dark mark left Margaret Halloway's house with a gnawing sense of dread settling deeper into his bones. The old woman had given him some answers, but with those answers came more questions, and the realization that time was running out. He had barely 3 days until the full moon, the deadline Sophie had mentioned in her eerie late-night conversations. Whatever dark ritual Sophie was planning, Mark knew he had to stop it before it was too late. As John drove the truck back toward his place, Mark sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window in a daze. Emily was asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the fear and confusion that had consumed her life over the past few days. Mark clenched his fists, his heart racing with a mixture of anger, fear, and desperation. He wasn't just dealing with the loss of his wife. He was facing an enemy he didn't fully understand, an enemy who had hidden in plain sight for years. "I can't believe this," John muttered, breaking the silence as they passed the familiar country roads. "Witches, rituals? It's like something out of a horror movie. Mark nodded grimly. I wouldn't believe it either if I wasn't living it. But Margaret was right. Sophie's not the woman I thought she was. She's been hiding something. Something dark. John kept his eyes on the road, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. So what's the plan? Do we just wait for the full moon and hope to stop whatever she's planning? Mark shook his head. No, we can't wait. We have to stop her before she completes whatever ritual she's been preparing for. Margaret said there are ways to break her connection to whatever it is she's been summoning. We need to act fast. John glanced at Mark, his face set in determination. I'm with you, man. Whatever you need, I'm here. But we're going to need more than just guts to take her on. She's dangerous. Mark nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. Margaret gave us a list of people who might be able to help, people who know about this kind of dark magic. We need to reach out to them and figure out how to break Sophie's hold before the full moon. John pulled the truck into the driveway of his small farmhouse, parking near the front porch. The place was quiet and isolated, nestled among the trees, offering a sense of safety. But Mark knew that no place was truly safe, not while Sophie was out there, plotting. As they got out of the truck, Emily stirred in the backseat, blinking sleepily. Dad, where are we? Mark opened the door and helped her out, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. We're at John's place, sweetie. We're going to stay here for a little while, okay? Emily nodded, though fear still lingered in her eyes. What about Sophie? Is she going to find us? Mark's chest tightened. He didn't want to lie to her, but the truth was too terrifying. I'm not going to let her hurt you, Emily. We're going to figure this out. They made their way inside, and John immediately locked the doors, pulling the curtains shut. The house was small but cozy, a far cry from the nightmare Mark had just escaped from. As Emily settled down on the couch with a blanket, John and Mark sat at the kitchen table, going over their options. I've got a few guns in the shed, John said, his voice low. I know it sounds crazy, but if Sophie tries to come after us, we need to be ready. Mark hesitated. He wasn't a violent man by nature, and the idea of using a gun against Sophie, the woman he had once loved, was almost too much to bear. But he knew, deep down, that Sophie wasn't the same person anymore. Whatever she had become, whatever dark forces she had aligned herself with, she was dangerous. Deadly, even. Keep the guns ready, Mark said, his voice tight. But we need more than just brute force. We need to figure out how to stop her from completing the ritual. John nodded, his face grim. Let's start making some calls. Margaret said there are people who might be able to help. We don't have much time. Over the next several hours, Mark and John reached out to every name Margaret had given them. Most were reluctant to get involved, wary of the danger Sophie posed. But one name stood out: Elias Monroe, an old scholar and occultist who lived in the next town over. When Mark explained the situation, Elias didn't hesitate. I've been tracking Sophie for years, Elias said over the phone, his voice gravelly with age. I've seen her kind before. She's part of a long lineage of practitioners, people who deal in forbidden rituals and blood sacrifices. They gain power through ancient dark rites. If she's preparing for a ritual on the full moon, it's likely she needs a sacrifice, someone with a strong emotional connection to her. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Emily, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Yes, Elias said gravely. Your daughter is in grave danger. Sophie will try to use her as the key to the ritual. She needs the life force of someone innocent, someone tied to her by blood or bond. Mark's stomach turned. He had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud filled him with a new kind of dread. How do we stop her? There are ways to sever her connection to the dark forces she's summoning, Elias explained. But it won't be easy. You'll need to confront her during the ritual, disrupt the ceremony, and destroy the objects she's using to channel her power. That mirror you mentioned, it's likely one of the conduits. Break it, and you'll weaken her. Mark's hands tightened around the phone. What happens if we don't stop her in time? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Elias spoke again, his voice was filled with grim certainty. If the ritual is completed, Sophie will become something far more dangerous than she is now. She'll gain power beyond anything you can imagine. And Emily won't survive the process. That night, Mark barely slept. He sat in the living room, staring at the fire crackling in the fireplace, his mind racing. Sophie had chosen Emily as her target, a sacrifice for some twisted ritual that would give her immense power. The thought of losing Emily, of her life being taken in such a horrific way, filled him with a rage he had never known before. John sat beside him, his face lined with concern. "We'll stop her, Mark. I won't let anything happen to Emily." Mark nodded, though the weight of the situation was crushing him. "We have to move fast. The full moon is 2 days away. We need to be ready to face her." John clapped him on the back. "We'll be ready. Guns loaded, mirrors shattered, and if we need to, we'll take her down." The next morning, they began preparing for the confrontation. John retrieved his guns, cleaning and loading them with precision. Mark studied the notes Elias had given him, going over the details of the ritual and how they could disrupt it. Emily, sensing the gravity of the situation, stayed close to Mark, her small hand never leaving his side. As the hours ticked by, tension hung thick in the air. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sent a jolt of anxiety through Mark's body. He knew Sophie was out there, somewhere, waiting for the moment to strike. And when she did, they had to be ready. By the time night fell, the plan was set. Mark, John, and Elias, who had arrived later that evening, would confront Sophie at the abandoned farmhouse where Mark had first discovered her rituals. They would destroy the mirror and any other objects Sophie used to channel her power. And if necessary, they would stop her by any means necessary. But as they gathered their supplies and prepared to leave, something happened that sent a chill down Mark's spine. Emily, who had been sitting quietly by the window, suddenly gasped, her face pale. "Dad," she whispered, pointing out the window. "She's here." Mark rushed to the window, his heart racing. Outside, in the shadows of the trees, a figure stood. Sophie. She was waiting. In this part, the tension escalates as Mark, John, and Emily realize the full scope of Sophie's plan. They seek help from Elias, an occult scholar, and prepare for a final confrontation. The stakes are higher than ever, and the sense of urgency builds as the full moon approaches. The eerie presence of Sophie at the end sets the stage for a dramatic and dangerous showdown in the final part of the story. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as he stared out the window at the dark figure standing in the distance. Sophie's silhouette was barely visible, cloaked in shadows, but he knew it was her. She had found them, just as Elias had warned. Her timing was perfect. Only 2 days remained until the full moon, and Sophie had come to make her final move. Mark's hand tightened around the shotgun John had given him, his knuckles white with tension. He couldn't afford to hesitate now. Sophie was no longer the woman he had married. She was something far more dangerous. Her presence here meant the ritual was about to begin. If they didn't stop her tonight, Emily's life was at risk. John, standing beside Mark, peered out the window, his face grim. "She's just standing there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What the hell is she waiting for?" Mark's stomach churned. He knew what Sophie was waiting for. She was daring them to come after her, to follow her into whatever trap she had set. And they had no choice but to do exactly that. "We have to end this tonight," Mark said, his voice shaking with resolve. "She won't stop unless we stop her first. If we let her complete that ritual, Emily's gone." John nodded, his jaw clenched. "Then we'll stop her, but we have to be smart about this. We can't just walk into her trap." Elias, the elderly occult scholar who had joined them earlier, stepped forward, his sharp eyes glinting in the dim light of the room. "She's using fear as a weapon. She knows you'll come for her, and she's counting on that. But we have an advantage. She doesn't know we've prepared. We know how to break her ritual, and we know her weakness." Mark glanced at Elias, his voice tinged with desperation. "You're sure we can stop her?" Elias nodded solemnly. "I've dealt with her kind before. She's powerful, but not invincible. The mirror is her conduit. It's how she channels her power. Destroy that, and we sever her connection to the forces she's drawing upon. Without the mirror, she won't be able to complete the ritual." Mark took a deep breath, his eyes flicking toward Emily, who was sitting on the couch, pale and frightened but determined. She was trying to be brave, but he could see the fear in her eyes. This was all happening because of Sophie, and Mark had never felt more responsible for the safety of his daughter. "We'll take the truck," John said, breaking the silence. "Drive to the farmhouse and finish this. We've got guns, we've got Elias, and we know what we have to do." Mark nodded, his throat dry. The plan was simple. Confront Sophie at the abandoned farmhouse, destroy the mirror and any other objects she used for her rituals, and if necessary, take her down by force. But no plan could fully prepare them for what was about to unfold. The truck rumbled down the dark, winding road toward the abandoned farmhouse, its headlights cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the countryside. Mark sat in the passenger seat, his grip tight on the shotgun across his lap. John was driving, his face set in steely determination, while Elias sat in the back seat, a bag filled with ancient tools and symbols beside him, protection spells and items meant to counteract Sophie's dark magic. Emily was tucked between Mark and Elias, her small hand gripping her father's arm. She hadn't said much since they had spotted Sophie outside, but Mark could feel her trembling. He leaned down and whispered to her, trying to reassure her. "We're going to stop her, Em. I promise." Emily nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared, Dad." "I know," Mark said, his heart aching. "But I won't let anything happen to you." As they approached the farmhouse, the fog seemed to thicken, swirling around the truck like tendrils of smoke. The old, dilapidated building loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless. But Mark knew better. There was something alive inside that house. Something evil. John killed the engine, and the group sat in tense silence for a moment, staring at the shadowy structure. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. Elias was the first to speak, his voice a low, commanding whisper. "Remember, she'll be expecting us. Stay together, follow my lead, and whatever you do, destroy the mirror first. It's the key to everything." Mark and John exchanged a glance, both men steeling themselves for the confrontation ahead. They climbed out of the truck, weapons in hand, while Elias gathered his tools. Emily stayed close to Mark, her eyes wide as she stared at the farmhouse. The front door was slightly ajar, just as it had been the first time Mark had followed Sophie here. But this time, the air was heavier, thicker, as if the house itself was breathing. Shadows danced in the corners of Mark's vision, and for a moment, he swore he heard whispering, low, insidious voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They entered the house in silence, moving cautiously through the darkened rooms. The smell of dust and decay hung in the air, and every step seemed to echo louder than it should. Mark's heart raced as they made their way to the basement, the place where Sophie had conducted her strange rituals. The basement door was wide open, and a faint, eerie glow spilled up the stairs. Mark's pulse quickened. "She's down there." Elias led the way, muttering under his breath, as he held out a small talisman in front of him, warding off any dark forces that might be lurking. Mark followed closely behind, his shotgun raised and ready, while John covered their rear. As they descended into the basement, the glow grew brighter, and the air became stiflingly hot. The room was exactly as Mark remembered it. Candles arranged in a circle, strange symbols scrawled on the floor in chalk, and in the center of it all, the mirror. The same mirror Sophie had been speaking to, its surface gleaming with an unnatural light. But this time, Sophie wasn't standing in front of it alone. She was kneeling in the center of the circle, her hands raised in a gesture of supplication. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and wild, and a dark energy seemed to pulse around her like a living thing. Surrounding her were shadowy figures, indistinct shapes that flickered in and out of sight, like phantoms trapped between worlds. "Mark," Sophie said, her voice low and hollow as she turned to face him. "You shouldn't have come here." Mark's chest tightened at the sight of her. The woman he had once loved was barely recognizable now, twisted by whatever dark power she had invoked. Her eyes gleamed with something unnatural, something far beyond human understanding. "Sophie," Mark said, his voice shaking, "this has to stop. Whatever you're planning, it's not going to work." Sophie smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. "You don't understand, Mark. This is what I was meant to do. Emily, she's the key. Her life will give me the power I need to finish what I started." Mark's hands shook, but he kept the shotgun trained on her. "You're not taking Emily." Sophie's expression darkened, and the shadows around her seemed to writhe in response. "You can't stop me, Mark. It's already begun." Before Mark could react, Sophie raised her hands, and the mirror behind her pulsed with a blinding light. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath them shook violently. "Now," Elias shouted, stepping forward with his talisman held high. "Destroy the mirror." John didn't hesitate. He raised his gun and fired a single shot at the mirror. The blast echoed through the room, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. For a moment, everything went still. Then, all at once, the energy in the room exploded. The shadows around Sophie writhed and screamed, dissipating into the air like smoke. Sophie herself let out a blood-curdling scream, her body convulsing as the power she had drawn upon was ripped away from her. Mark rushed forward, pulling Emily into his arms as the room around them seemed to collapse in on itself. The chalk symbols on the floor faded, and the candles flickered out, plunging the basement into darkness. Sophie collapsed to the ground, her body limp and lifeless. Mark stared at her, his chest heaving. It was over. Elias stepped forward, his face grim. "The ritual is broken. She won't be able to harm you or Emily anymore." Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He held Emily close, his hands shaking with relief. They had done it. They had stopped Sophie's dark plan. But as he stared at Sophie's motionless body, a deep sadness washed over him. The woman he had loved was gone, consumed by the darkness she had chosen. They left the farmhouse just as dawn began to break, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the fog. Mark, Emily, John, and Elias stood in the driveway, watching as the old house slowly faded into the distance. "I'm sorry, Mark," John said quietly. "I know this isn't how you wanted things to end." Mark nodded, his